If a torn and battered woman emerged from the desert darkness, clutching a broken dog tag from the fallen, would you open the gate to save her or raise your weapon to stop her? The night at Red Mesa was still almost too still, the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest and made his heart pound harder than the desert wind ever could. Floodlights swept the sand, cutting across the emptiness until they found her. She was small against the vast horizon, a figure staggering forward every step a battle. Her uniform was shredded, the fabric clinging to skin streaked with blood and grit. Her boots barely held together, her shoulders hunched, as though the weight of her past pressed down heavier than the gear she had long lost. But her eyes, when the light struck her face, blazed with something unyielding. It wasn't fear. It wasn't surrender. It was the stubborn fire of someone who had chosen to keep moving, no matter the cost. In her right hand, fingers clenched around a jagged fragment of metal. A broken dog tag stamped with the numbers, 11-247, glinted beneath the harsh white light. In her left, a small prayer coin worn smooth along the edges, catching just enough shine to reveal it had been carried for years, maybe decades, through dirt, sweat, and tears. Symbols of a story no one yet knew. The seals on the wall shifted uneasily. Rifles came up. Triggers tightened. In this desert, nothing stumbled toward you unannounced, unless danger followed close behind. Civilians did not appear here. Strangers did not survive the mine-laced flats outside the wire. And yet here she was. At 200 yards, she swayed like a sapling in the wind. At 100, she nearly collapsed, then dragged herself upright again. 50 yards from the barrier, she clutched the fence, her bloody fingers curling around steel as though it alone held her upright. Commander Harris lowered his binoculars, the desert shadows cutting sharp lines into his weathered face. His voice came low and hard, carrying enough weight to silence every man on post. Gatehold. And in that single breath, the question hung heavy. Was this woman salvation, or was she the spark that would burn them all? The floodlight stayed fixed on the lone figure swaying at the perimeter fence. Every man on duty knew the impulse. Rush forward, drag her inside, patch the wounds. But impulse got soldiers killed. Commander Harris's order held the line. Gatehold, he repeated sharper this time. The seals moved with practiced precision. What looked like hesitation to the untrained eye was, in truth, the opposite. A strict sequence drilled into them from years of combat. They called it the 5C Protocol Confirm Clear Cordon Control Call EOD. No one stepped through a gate until every box was checked. First came confirm. Through high-powered optics, 2 men studied the woman's every motion. Did she carry a pack? Any wires, bulges under the fabric? Telltale signs of explosives? One SEAL muttered, "No vest, no ruck. She's bleeding, but that could be bait." The other didn't answer, only adjusted the focus on his scope, following the tremor of her hands as they gripped the fence. Then came clear. A third operator crouched low, ran a mirror pole under the ground's edge, searching for pressure plates or trip wires hidden near the barrier. Nothing gleamed back but dust. Still the pole swept again, inch by inch. Cordon followed. Men spread into a half-moon, rifles leveled outward as much as inward. The desert beyond could hide a dozen shooters waiting for a soft-hearted American to swing the gate. The floodlights widened their arc, burning shadows off the sand. The woman blinked into the glare, but didn't flinch away. Control. 2 handlers brought forward K9s, their lean muscles, taut noses working the air. The dogs stiffened, tails high, then whined low, uncertain. They smelled blood, sweat, and sand, but no trace of explosives. One handler gave a silent nod. Finally, call EOD. The radio crackled softly as Harris ordered an explosives tech to stand by, kit in hand, in case the situation shifted. The base would not gamble. Not tonight. Not ever. The men on the wall still held their rifles up, but the tension had changed. They weren't panicked. They were professionals walking the narrow edge between caution and compassion. To the uninitiated, Hollywood might show a dramatic rescue in seconds. Here, seconds stretched into eternity because survival demanded it. And all the while, the battered woman stood silent in the floodlight's glare, gripping her broken tag and coin as if daring them to decide, was she threat or salvation? The gate clanged shut behind her, and with that final sound, Nora's legs gave way. She collapsed onto the dirt floor inside the perimeter, the broken dog tag slipping from her hand. Medics rushed forward, lifting her onto a stretcher with swift, practiced movements. Inside the medical tent, the sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air. Under the harsh fluorescent light, her wounds looked even worse. Deep gashes across her ribs, a jagged cut along her thigh bruises, blooming dark against pale skin. The lead medic snapped on gloves and pulled a vial from his kit. "Morphine 1 ml," he said, briskly. "She won't last the stitching without it." But before the needle touched her arm, Nora's hand shot up. Weak as she was, her grip clamped around the medic's wrist like steel. Her voice rasped, raw from dust and blood, but steady. "No drugs. I need to stay alert." The medic blinked, startled. "Ma'am, with these injuries," I said no. Her eyes bored into his, unflinching, daring him to challenge her resolve. Slowly, reluctantly, the medic lowered the syringe. Around the edges of the tent, SEALs watched in silence. They had seen men twice her size cry out under lesser wounds. One whispered low enough for only his comrades to hear. "No one survives that kind of pain without blacking out." Another muttered back, "She's different." As the medic stitched, cleaned, and bandaged, Nora bit down hard on her lip, not a single cry escaping. The tent filled only with the quiet scrape of tools and her ragged, controlled breaths. In that silence, respect began to grow, not the kind granted by rank or medals, but the kind earned through suffering, endured without complaint. The medical tent had grown quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of boots. The SEALs ringed the edges, still uneasy, still trying to place the battered stranger who had walked through their gate like a ghost refusing to fall. One of them stepped forward. Cole, broad-shouldered, square jaw, the kind of man who measured trust in performance, not sympathy. He set something heavy onto the table beside her cot, the upper receiver of an M4 carbine. His voice was steady but laced with challenge. "Show us you're not just stubborn. Let's see what you really know." Nora's pale fingers brushed the weapon. She didn't scramble to impress, didn't rush into a flashy display. Instead, she turned it slowly in her hands, eyes tracing over metal worn smooth from countless rounds. She ran a thumb across the bolt, then held it out for Cole to see. "Dry," she said simply. "No oil. You'll get a jam after 3 mags, maybe sooner." Cole's brow furrowed. He hadn't noticed. Next, she tilted the receiver toward the floodlight, squinting at the chamber. Her nail tapped against a tiny ridge inside. Feed ramp burr. Small now, but enough to cause a misfeed if you're moving fast. A ripple of whispers circled the tent. Finally, she lifted the takedown pin, rolling it between her fingers, before setting it down with deliberate care. "This pin's worn. Accuracy drops an inch at 100 yards, enough to cost you when it matters." Silence followed. Not disbelief, respect. She laid the receiver back onto the table, her hands trembling from blood loss, but her eyes steady. "A weapon," she murmured, "isn't just firepower. It's a promise. Break it and someone dies." Cole said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Around the room, suspicion began to thin, replaced by something heavier. Curiosity, recognition. Later that night, when the base had quieted to little more than the thrum of generators and the shuffle of boots on gravel, Nora rose from her cot. Her steps were slow but steady, carrying her out into the open air, where the desert wind pressed cool against her bandaged skin. She stopped before the memorial wall. A long panel of names and photographs, faces of men and women who had walked into the storm and never returned. The floodlights washed the wall in pale gold, their glow catching on the edges of laminated photos, on creased letters tucked into corners, on tokens left behind by grieving hands. From her pocket, Nora drew the small prayer coin. The metal was worn smooth, its surface rubbed nearly flat by years of restless fingers. She held it against her chest for a moment, then pressed it gently against the wall. Her eyes scanned until they stopped on one picture. Elijah W. The young man's face stared back, smiling as if the camera had caught him between jokes. Her thumb traced the coin's edge, and though her lips did not move, her breath caught in a way that betrayed memory. Grief, something unspoken. For a long moment she stood there, unmoving, unflinching, but not untouched. Behind her, a pair of SEALs paused in their patrol, glancing at the scene. Neither said a word. They only watched, struck by the quiet ritual. And the question lingered in the air. Who was Elijah W., and why did she carry his memory with her? Commander Harris had watched from a distance as Nora lingered at the memorial wall, her coin pressed against the photograph of Elijah W. He told himself it was nothing more than ritual, the kind of act any soldier might perform when standing before the fallen. But when the medics returned her belongings to his desk for inspection, something caught his eye. The broken dog tag. He picked it up carefully, turning it in the dim light of his quarters. At first glance, it was standard issue, stamped numbers, rough edges from where it had snapped in two. But when he tilted it just right, the back revealed a faint engraving, almost hidden under grime. A white orchid. Harris froze. The insignia was small, delicate, but unmistakable. Years of classified briefings surged back into his memory. The whispered name, Project ORCHID, a program denied in daylight, buried beneath layers of black ink and sealed files. Few had ever spoken of it. Fewer still had lived it. His jaw tightened as he pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk. From within, he withdrew a thin envelope, the paper yellowed from years in storage. Across its front, stamped in thick black letters, ORCHID W11247. For a long moment, Harris simply stared at the envelope, the weight of its presence pressing harder than the desert heat outside. Then, with deliberate care, he locked it back away, sliding the key into his pocket. When he finally exhaled, his face was carved with something the men outside would never see: shock and perhaps guilt. The mystery deepened. Whoever Nora Whitfield was, she was no ordinary survivor. She was a remnant of something the world was never meant to know. The desert base lived on rhythm, the buzz of generators, the static of radios, the heavy footsteps of men drilled into routine. But war has its way of stripping order with a single flicker of chaos. It began with the lights. One moment, the compound glowed under harsh beams. The next, it was swallowed whole by blackness. A collective breath caught in the throats of men trained to sense danger in every shadow. Blackout drill, someone barked, though no one had called for it. Boots scraped, rifles came up. Eyes darted into the dark. Nora moved before anyone else. She didn't shout, her voice was still too frayed, but her hands did the talking. She stepped into a narrow beam of moonlight, raised a hand, and tapped the shoulder of the SEAL closest to her. He stiffened, then stilled as she pressed her palm firmly against his hand. With her chin, she pointed left, then turned her head in a sharp, deliberate angle. 3 gestures, simple, silent. Shoulder tap, I'm here. Hand press, you hold. Head turn, eyes left. The SEAL understood instantly, his breathing leveling out. He mirrored the signal down the line. In seconds, the panic thinned, replaced by cohesion. A ripple of silent control moved across the darkness until the men had repositioned, steady and calm. When the backup power finally snapped, the lights back on the room glowed not with relief, but with something more surprising recognition. The stranger had brought order, where even training had faltered. Later that week, another test arrived without warning. The UAV feed eyes in the sky, their constant reassurance cut out mid-patrol. The grainy images of the desert terrain dissolved into static. Voices rose over the comms, frustration tinged with unease. Before the commander could issue a fallback, Nora, still bandaged and pale, leaned forward over the operations table. Her voice was quiet but certain. Defensive arcs, she said, her finger tracing invisible lines across the map. Here, here, and here. You'll need overlapping fields. Always leave a backstop. The SEALs stared, blinking. Backstop, one muttered. Nora met his eyes, patient but sharp. It's not enough to know where you're shooting. You need to know what's behind your target. Walls don't stop everything. Stone breaks. Bullets keep going. You want to keep your brothers alive, you build a backstop. The room went silent. Even Harris' arms folded at the far end, studied her with something between suspicion and respect. In the field, the advice proved itself. When the patrol hit a stretch of open ground, her defensive arcs kept them locked in a tight circle, each man covering not just empty space, but the lives of the men beside him. A round cracked from the ridge-shattering rock. Dust sprayed, but no one panicked. They held controlled exactly where she had drawn the lines. Back at base, Ramirez, broad-shouldered, and never one to hold his tongue, muttered under his breath as she passed. She's no civilian. It wasn't meant for her ears, but Nora heard it all the same. For the first time since she had staggered through the gate, the label of outsider began to shift. Not fully trust. Not yet. But the first threads of belief woven in silence. The desert was always loud in the day. Boots shouts, engines, steel on steel. But when night dropped its curtain, the base seemed to shrink into itself, and silence ruled again. Nora sat outside the medical tent, the floodlights painting her in pale edges. Her bandages were still fresh, but her spine stayed straight, her chin lifted. In her hand, she turned the prayer coin, rolling its worn edges, with her thumb over and over. The habit was almost unconscious, the way a man might worry a wedding ring or a rosary. Private Young, the youngest SEAL on base, passed by on patrol. He was still green enough to be restless, when nothing happened old enough to know better than to underestimate silence. His eyes caught the small ritual, Nora lifting the coin, pressing it briefly to her lips, then rising slowly to walk toward the memorial wall. She stopped before the panel, where photos of the fallen were taped and pinned with quiet reverence. Letters folded into plastic sleeves rustled in the wind. Young slowed his step, careful not to intrude, but unable to look away. Nora placed the coin just beneath one picture, Elijah W. A boyish grin froze in time, the kind of grin carried into battle by men who thought they'd have decades to wear it. She touched the edge of the photograph, her hand lingering as though the paper could somehow still be warm. A voiceover carried the weight of her silence, low and steady. Old soldiers rise before dawn, not from habit, but to remember those who never rise again. The words were not hers, not his, but they seemed to float from the coin itself, as if every fingerprint rubbed into its surface spoke now for the ones who had fallen. Young felt his throat tighten. His father had carried a coin, too, back in Fallujah. His grandfather, a worn rosary through the jungles of Vietnam. He wondered how many tokens of memory the ground beneath his boots was already holding. Nora's gaze stayed fixed on Elijah W.'s smile, her face a mask of control, but her fingers trembled just enough for Young to see. She whispered something too soft to catch, but the coin gleamed as if it had answered. Behind her, the wind rattled the canvas of the tents. Inside, the older SEALs played cards, their laughter subdued. They didn't see her. But Young did. And though he said nothing, he carried the image back with him, the picture of a woman who bore her ghosts in silence, the way soldiers always had. Later, when he returned to his bunk, he told no one. Yet he lay awake long after lights out, the voice still echoing in his mind. Old soldiers rise before dawn, not from habit, but to remember those who never rise again. The coin had reappeared, its loop tightening. What had begun as a mystery token now anchored something deeper. Grief, remembrance, and the bond that tied strangers into one family of the fallen. And for the men who watched from the shadows, questions stirred like dust. Who was Elijah W.? What bound this scarred woman to him so tightly that even a coin could not let go? The desert sky was washed in pale gray when the recon team returned, boots dragging dust into the operations tent. Maps and screens spread across the table, glowing faintly under low lights. Radios crackled with static, carrying voices from higher command. Recon confirms possible survivors east of Sector 9. Briggs reported pulling off his headset. Heat signatures, 5, maybe 6. Non-combatants. Before he could continue, the speaker erupted sharp and cold from headquarters. Negative. Repeat, ignore civilian signals. Rules of engagement prohibit deviation. Stay on mission. The line went dead, leaving silence heavy as stone. Around the table, men shifted uncomfortably. Everyone had heard the same order: civilians would be left behind. No discussion. No rescue. Nora stood at the edge of the tent, her face pale beneath bandages, her coin hidden deep in her palm. She didn't speak, not yet. Her breathing was steady, her eyes locked on the glowing map. Orders are clear, Cole muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. We're not to engage. Harris's jaw worked as he stared at the map, the creases on his weathered face deeper than usual. Years of command had carved him into stone, yet this order left a fissure. He had lost men before. He had carried the weight of missions completed by the book that haunted him long after the after-action reports were filed away. Then, without warning, Nora stepped forward. She pulled the broken dog tag from her pocket and set it down squarely on Sector 9. The steel clink echoed louder than any order. Not a word, just a challenge, silent, unyielding. The men watched her breath caught in their throats. Ramirez leaned forward, whispering, "She's saying we can't leave them." Cole shot him a look. She's not in command. But Harris's eyes never left the tag. The faint orchid engraving on its back seemed to gleam under the tense light, a reminder of secrets he couldn't speak. For a long moment he weighed steel against conscience policy, against humanity. Finally he exhaled the sound, heavy with the years he had lived under regulations that didn't always fit the battlefield. "Humanitarian corridor," he said, at last. His voice was gravel, but carried authority no one dared challenge. 6 minutes. No more. Heads snapped toward him. 6 minutes wasn't much, barely enough to reach the heat signatures, confirm, and pull out. But it was something. It was a crack in the wall of indifference. The SEALs prepared quickly, movements sharp and precise. They would obey his compromise, not disobeying orders entirely. Not blind to the risks, but not heartless either. Nora picked up the tag again, slipping it back into her fist. She didn't smile, didn't nod. But in the flicker of her eyes, there was a flash of respect, brief but unmistakable. As the team filed out, Harris remained at the table. His hand lingered over the map palm pressed flat against the sector where the tag had lain. For all the decades of soldiering, this was the war no one prepared him for. Bullets and tactics were one thing, but every now and then, war demanded something harsher, the courage to disobey, without breaking, to bend, without shattering, to give 6 minutes when the world would rather give none. The educational truth was stark, even for the men watching from outside the scene. War wasn't just measured in firepower. It was measured in choices, messy, imperfect, and human. And in the hush that followed, one thought bound them all, though no one dared speak it aloud. Commander Harris was no heartless machine. He was still a man, and men could choose. The night dragged long, the kind of night where silence cut sharper than any blade. Harris sat alone in his quarters, the low desk lamp throwing harsh shadows across the papers stacked in front of him. His hand hovered over the bottom drawer, hesitating as if the lock itself might bite. Finally, with a muttered curse, he slid the key in and turned it. The drawer opened with a reluctant groan. Inside lay the envelope, thin brittle at the edges, its label stamped in stark black ORCHID. W11 247. He had carried it through 3 base transfers, never opening. It always telling himself it was someone else's concern. But now the past had walked through his gate, wearing bandages and a stare too familiar to ignore. He broke the seal. The first page was a photograph, blurred, as if smudged deliberately. The figures were indistinct, a team half caught mid-motion, but enough was visible to make Harris's stomach tighten uniforms, insignias, and in the corner, the faint white orchid. Beneath it lay the report. Entire sections had been drowned in black ink paragraphs, reduced to unreadable blocks. Only fragments survived. Extraction compromised. Assets expendable. Collateral risk acceptable. The words clawed at him. He knew the phrasing, bureaucratic, cold, the language of men who had never walked the ground they condemned. And at the bottom, half buried beneath signatures, one line burned through him, authorized. Call M. Harris. His breath caught. The memory slammed back without mercy. He had been younger, then eager for command, desperate to prove he could make the hard calls. A report had crossed his desk, labeled urgent. He had signed it in less than a minute, not knowing the faces, not asking the questions. He had signed away the ORCHID team. The room felt smaller air thick and heavy. His chest heaved as though the desert itself pressed against him. From the shadows of the doorway came a whisper. Fragile, but sharp enough to cut. You signed that order. 126 days ago. Harris jerked his head up. Nora stood in the doorway, pale but steady, her coin glinting between her fingers. Her voice wasn't accusing. Not yet, it was colder. Worse, it was fact. His mouth opened, but words caught in his throat. How could he explain that the order had been one of hundreds, buried under the avalanche of bureaucracy? That he hadn't known her face, hadn't realized her team had been left to die. Yet explanations were ash. Orders or not, the signature was his. The weight belonged to him. I didn't know, he rasped. God help me, I didn't know. Nora's eyes didn't soften. She stepped forward, placed the coin on his desk beside the photo. For a moment, her bandaged hand rested on the blurred image as though touching ghosts. You knew enough to sign, she said. Harris bowed his head. The lamp's glow carved deep lines into his face, exposing the years, the regrets he had buried under layers of command. The men outside believed he was steel. Only here, only now did he feel hollow. The silence stretched taut and unbearable. Every tick of the clock hammered the question deeper. Would she forgive, or would she expose? Her gaze lingered on him, unblinking. She had survived what his pen had condemned, and now the power sat in her hands. The twist was no longer about missions or rules. It was about guilt, the hidden kind, that rots from the inside, and the truth that sometimes the gravest wounds aren't written on skin, but on paper, signed in ink. As she turned to leave, she left the coin and the envelope on his desk. Harris stared at them as though they might ignite, and in the quiet, the hook tightened. What would Nora do with the truth, offer him the mercy of silence, or the judgment of revelation? The desert was a cruel teacher. It taught patience with silence, fear with shadows, and humility with the sudden crack of gunfire. The SEAL patrol moved along the jagged ridges of Red Mesa just before dawn, their boots whispering over sand that seemed to hold its breath. The air was cool but tense, every man alert rifles, sweeping arcs across rock and scrub. Nora was with them, not leading, never given that right, but walking in their circle of trust bandages hidden beneath her gear. Her coin rested in her palm, cool and worn the way others might hold a cross or dog tag. They were 3 clicks out when the desert exploded. The first shots came sharp, echoing from the cliffs. Dust and stone erupted shards, stinging faces, helmets ringing with impact. Ramirez dove behind a boulder, swearing, while Briggs went prone, scanning for muzzle flashes through the chaos. Cole spun to cover the rear, his barrel tracing arcs, searching for shapes in the ridges. Contact front and rear, Ramirez shouted voice-clipped training, overriding panic. Automatic fire poured down in sheets, pinning them in a deadly crossfire. The open desert offered little cover, just scattered rocks and thin brush. Bullets hissed and snapped, biting dirt inches from their boots. Nora's eyes narrowed. She didn't pick up a rifle. She wasn't here to play super soldier. Instead, she moved low to Harris's side, her voice steady. Ramirez assault right flank. Briggs cover with suppressive fire. Cole secure the rear arc. Keep it tight. The SEALs hesitated. Orders didn't come from her. But Harris caught her look, weighed the storm around them, then gave a curt nod. Do it. Training took over. Briggs's rifle roared, stitching bursts into the ridgeline, forcing enemy heads down. Ramirez darted from cover, sprinting low grenades thumping as they detonated along the flank. Cole pivoted smoothly, securing their 6, his eyes sweeping for any push from behind. Nora crouched, scanning lines of fire, watching for angles. She wasn't a ghost, wasn't untouchable, just precise. Her coin gleamed between her fingers, flipping once then again, a ritual to steady breath and thought. Then she saw it. Ramirez was cut off, pinned in a shallow ravine as gunfire rained down. His cover wouldn't hold. He needed calm, needed a signal that he wasn't alone. Nora rose just enough, drew in a breath, and flicked her coin high into the air. The small disc spun in the weak dawn light, flashing like a beacon. It arced, catching Ramirez's eye mid-duck. He froze, then saw her across the chaos, hand raised calm, steady. The coin wasn't just a trinket. It was a message. Breathe. Hold. Move when I move. She dropped her hand. Briggs shifted fire. Cole barked a short cover signal. Ramirez broke cover, rolling hard into a new position, just as enemy fire shredded the space he'd left. Alive. The coin clattered back into Nora's palm, hot from its brief flight, its loop fulfilled. What had been grief became guidance. What had been ritual became survival. The ambush didn't end quickly. It dragged on in brutal minutes of bursts and silences of shifting arcs and shouted signals. But something had changed. The SEALs weren't just reacting. They were listening, adjusting, covering each other with precision that felt sharpened by her presence. Angles, Nora shouted, pointing. Backstops, Briggs adjusted his line, realizing the rounds he'd been laying risked ricocheting too close to his own men. Cole shifted his sector, snapping off controlled bursts instead of wild sprays. Harris moved them as a unit, every command now shadowed by the ghost of her counsel. When the last shots cracked, and the desert fell back into silence. The patrol held fast. Dust settled slowly. Smoke curling off hot barrels. Bodies lay still along the ridges, some theirs, most not. But the team was intact, alive, breathing hard, bruised but whole. Ramirez staggered back toward the group helmet, askew eyes blazing with adrenaline. He looked at Nora, then down at her closed fist. He'd seen the coin's arc save his life. "You're no ghost," he muttered, breath ragged. "You're one of us." The men didn't cheer, didn't shout. They didn't need to. In the silence that followed, every man knew the truth. She had held them together in the storm. Not by superhuman strength, by something rarer, clarity, calm, and the courage to act when it mattered most. The desert was cruel, but tonight it had taught a different lesson. Survival wasn't about the lone hero. It was about trust angles, backstops, teamwork, and sometimes about a single coin tossed into the air at the right moment to remind a man he wasn't alone. The patrol had barely staggered back into defensive formation when the radios hissed a live static, crackling like dry brush under flame. At first it was nothing but garbled noise, the usual interference that came with the ridges. Then, clear as a bell in the quiet dawn, came the words that froze every man in place. ORCHID 11. Respond. Every head turned. Harris's face went pale. Ramirez's hand tightened on his rifle. Briggs mouthed the words, silently disbelieving. Nora stood very still, her coin clenched so tightly it bit into her palm. ORCHID 11. The numbers on her broken dog tag. The call sign she thought had died with her team. The voice repeated firmer now, like a hand reaching through time. ORCHID 11, this is command. Confirm status. The SEALs looked at Harris, waiting. But Harris wasn't looking at them. He was looking at her. His eyes carried the weight of secrets sealed too long. The truth spilled slowly, like poison loosed from a cracked vial. Project ORCHID hadn't been disbanded. It had been absorbed, its surviving operators folded into a covert resilience program, a hidden branch meant to test endurance, loyalty, and silence under impossible conditions. The dead were recorded. The living were erased. Their names scrubbed from files, their existence denied, their service paid for in shadows. Nora had not been abandoned. She had been written out. The weight of it hit like another ambush. She wasn't a casualty. She wasn't even a ghost. She was a secret someone had chosen to bury. The radio continued to buzz, waiting for her reply. But Nora said nothing. Her lips parted, then closed again. Her hand opened slowly, the coin gleaming faintly in the rising sun. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ramirez whispered what everyone else was thinking. She's not supposed to exist. The mini-hook tightened around the silence. Would Nora accept this twisted kind of survival living as an erased name in a hidden ledger? Or would she fight to claim the truth for herself, for Elijah W., for every soldier who'd been struck from the record to make a program look clean? Her coin spun once in her palm, catching light like a question with no easy answer. The mess hall was quiet that evening, a rare hush after weeks of restless whispers. The desert winds rattled the tin roof, but inside the air felt heavier than the sandstorms outside. Nora entered slowly, her bandages still tied across her ribs. She walked with deliberate calm, neither proud nor broken, carrying something small in her hand. At the memorial wall, simple frames, faces of the fallen. She stopped. The light from a single bulb cast her shadow across Elijah W.'s photograph. Without a word, she placed her broken dog tag beside it, the jagged edge catching the light. Next to the tag, she laid her coin flat, the worn prayer etched into its surface, glinting faintly. A small act, almost invisible, but the SEALs watching from across the room felt the weight of it. Commander Harris stood behind her, silent for a moment. Then, without ceremony, he pulled a folder from under his arm. Inside was a draft report, not classified, not redacted, something different. In steady strokes of his pen, he wrote what had been denied for years. Recognition of Nora Whitfield designated advisor in humanitarian SOP. It was more than paperwork. It was an act of witness, proof that she existed, that her service mattered even if the official archives would never say her name. Later, the soldiers gathered for their evening meal. The clatter of trays, the scrape of boots all muted. Then Ramirez raised his cup, his voice carrying softly but firmly. To those who didn't wake up, every man around the table lifted his own cup. So we rise earlier. The toast echoed through the hall, reverent and steady. For the first time, Nora lifted her own cup, too. Not high, not boldly, just enough that the gesture met theirs. The loops closed like quiet knots. The dog tag by Elijah's photo. The coin that had saved lives. The folded flag above the wall. Symbols of loss now transformed into symbols of belonging. The SEALs didn't cheer. They didn't clap. But when Nora sat among them, no one sat apart. The space at the table closed around her like a circle, warm and unbroken. In that silence, something shifted. She was no longer the ghost at the gate. She was one of them. The desert night closed softly around the camp, but the story it held would not fade. Nora's presence had become more than survival, more than mystery. She was living proof that honor is not forged in medals or parades. It is found in the quiet, unseen choices the hand steadied in the dark, the breath shared in silence, the strength to stand for someone when no one is watching. Sometimes true honor is holding a comrade's hand without ever asking their name. From a storyteller's lens, the heart of this journey was never just about action or secrecy. It was about connection. The broken dog tag, the worn prayer coin, and the flag above the memorial were not random details. They were loops threads tying the audience back again and again, keeping their attention, reminding them that every symbol carries weight. These anchors kept the story alive in memory, long after each scene passed. The procedures the 5C security checks, the lessons about backstops and weapon care, were more than military details. They were gifts of knowledge woven in so the audience could walk away, not only moved, but wiser. For older viewers, many of whom lived through Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, these truths rang clear. The battlefield is not only bullets, it is choices, rules, and the human cost of every order. And the ethical twists, the commander's guilt, the silence of a soldier erased the choice to save civilians, despite the rules, spoke to the hearts of those who carry memories that never made it into official reports. These turns of conscience are what make the story not just gripping, but resonant. So if this story reminded you of a fallen comrade, a brother, a sister, or a loved one, I invite you to write their name below. In doing so, we keep their light burning together. Like, share, and subscribe so we can continue honoring the memories not written in official records, but alive in the hearts of those who remember.